Hello there. This is the fourth lecture that we're going to have today with you guys. Um, it is week four, and if previously we talked about uh, America, we talked about the New World, but also Asia, getting a little closer to Europe. And this time we're now going to be talking about the multiculturalism or the encounters of different cultures with Europeans, or rather, we're going to focus on non uh, traditional white European experience. We're going to focus on the Ottomans. Now, why did I say that we're not going to focus on like white Europeans, right, on the traditional Europe? Because Ottoman Empire is de facto a European country, right, and has always been an integral part of European affairs from its very appearance as an empire, as an independent state. It is one of the most long-lived empires of the world. It lasted since 1299 up to 1922. Right after the First World War, it has basically dissolved and fallen apart, being one of the losers of the World War One, and having piled up quite a lot of issues internally. And it covered a wide swath of the Middle East, North Africa, Southeastern Europe. It was led by Turkish leaders called sultans, and the Ottoman Empire became the dominant force of this part of the world in the 1400s and remained as such up until 1600. So for about 200 years, it has been slightly more. It has been quite a dominant power in the region, one of the most revered and feared powers in Europe. Uh, and it basically threatened Central Europe until the failure of the Siege of Vienna, which only ended in 1683. It is a turning point in the development of the Ottoman Empire because 1683 is the end of European conquest for the Ottomans. They stopped expanding, they failed to conquer Vienna, and they stopped expanding their possessions in Europe. After this moment, they will only lose, not expand, at least their territories in Europe. The seat of this Islamic Empire is the former capital of Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, known as Istanbul, but formerly Constantinople. Um, it was conquered by the Ottomans in 1453, and by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in rapid decline until its collapse. Once again, something that I already mentioned. It arose at the time when European society was by no means dominant. There was that transition point where the Europeans have been only starting to get a hand of, started to get ahead in terms of development. It was still late medieval time. It was still several hundred years before the Renaissance. So Europeans were by no means dominant or powerful. Um, Ottoman Empire outshined them in power and culture significantly, just like as the Asian empires did. Um, During its peak, the Ottoman Empire was admired for its innovations in architecture, arts, sciences, well-educated officials, and well-trained bureaucrats that have been running the empire. The Ottoman army inspired awe in all of its neighbors, and also inspired fear in the enemies. Ottoman ruling elite, mainly ethnic Turks, who are migrants from Central Asia, often exploited the people that they conquered, both Muslim and non-Muslim. However, the Ottoman Empire was and remains known as an empire of difference, containing so many different people and populations, not just ethnically, not just nationally, but also religiously and all the other aspects as well. And it is the nickname given to it. The way it respected and thus retained the loyalty of its diverse subjects, again, in terms of ethnically and religiously, and for generally welcoming and tolerating all these different people, while the rest of the world was largely xenophobic. This is the map that unravels the scale of this large and very powerful empire. So the lighter brown, the beige, right? It stands for um, the golden age of uh, the Ottoman Empire, with the territories covering most of Hungary, Bulgaria, Greece, Greece, also Crimea right here. So huge territory right here. Armenia as well, right? A bunch of territories in North Africa. But then the extent of the empire, of course, has shrunk quite a lot by 1914, right? When the empire has already been having so much trouble internally and also externally, has lost its leverage, it's not made quite powerful. And not as rich as before, but also still quite significant in terms of their wealth. So still a big territory even by the standards of 1914. However, of course, not as big as it used to be. And as you can see, strategically, their territories are quite well aligned with control of the Arabian Sea, Red Sea, Persian Gulf, Mediterranean Sea, even Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. So they have been controlling the path to the Asian trade and have been obviously collecting the benefits from that quite profitable endeavor. The attitudes towards the outsiders. Western chroniclers strategically positioned themselves as as the opposite to the Ottoman Empire because they've been chronically characterizing them as the Ottomans as deeply hostile to everything non-Muslim. Just like in their logic, it was either black or white, right? There was a binary logic. Either you're Muslim or you're Christian, right? And of course, the first group and the second group, they were not able, in the eyes of the Western chroniclers, to live together, coexist together. This portrayed is, of course, badly flawed because, sorry, because it is quite obvious that people of the Ottoman Empire were never really hostile to Muslims. In fact, the Ottomans married their princes quite openly into Orthodox Christian families and used young Christian slaves from the Balkans to populate the Janissary Corps, the elite Ottoman Guard. Of course, they were slaves, right? But um, Janissaries were no ordinary slaves. They were the military elite, meaning that as soon as they got into the Janissary Corps, they were able to rise to a certain rank that would position them much higher than ordinary people. All right, quite often able to influence the most significant political decisions and events in the empire. Um, in addition, the Ottomans took advantage of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. So while the Spanish have strategically expulsed all the Jews because they owed the crown owed so much money to them, and outlining the religious differences and things like banking that weren't okay with the Catholic Church originally, and the Jews have been actively doing um, lending money for profit. The Ottomans looked at them as an asset and they invited those Jews because most of those people have been talented craftsmen or bankers or traders, and they invited that talent to come to the empire, settle on the territory, and live under their own laws and customs. The only thing they ask for is loyalty to the empire, to the Sultan. And that's what they did. They attracted talent before it has been, it has become so popular, fashionable, um, like in the modern day. So yeah, they invited these people and benefited. The empire benefited from that empire because Jewish merchants from Europe, North Africa, they brought expertise in trade, financing, and crafts, which were very much needed by the Ottomans, and it helped the empire to prosper and collect more benefit, more welfare, more money. Istanbul, it is the picture of Istanbul during the Ottoman Empire. It was quite a busy city. It was magnificent in terms of scale and grandeur and the riches that have been there. Absolutely mind-blowing, especially to the Europeans, most of which have lived in tiny cities by comparison to Istanbul. Amman, right? This is where it gets interesting because uh, the reason why we believe the Ottoman Empire was perhaps one of the most tolerant places of its own time, definitely in terms of empires, it was one of the most tolerant empires in the whole entire world in history because they had Amman. Amman is the official Ottoman policy towards the outsiders, and this is important to make a distinction because people of different religion and ethnical origin, but who are subjects of Sultan, that's an entirely different situation. They are locals. They are the subjects of sultans despite being non-Muslims. Outsiders, people who are subjects of, let's say, Queen of England or King of England or King of France or whoever, right? Uh, Foreigners from other countries, right? Um, they typically in the world of that time, in the late medieval time, early Renaissance, and even up until the Enlightenment, they basically had no rights in the country that they've gone to. It was done at their own risk because they're the subject of their own king. He's the one to offer you protection and justice, whatever. Here, you don't count for that because, again, a local ruler has no responsibility as it comes, when it comes to your well-being, and when it comes to laws and you needing protection. So the Ottoman Empire here has been quite groundbreaking because they offered this policy called Aman. It is the policy of toleration and protection within their own territory for the foreigners. The foreigner requested this protection in return for promising to be peaceful and friendly towards the Ottomans. This policy was unlike policies towards the foreigners pursued by the Japanese and the Chinese, who limited the activities of foreigners quite greatly and have often reviewed them with suspicion, right? They didn't really like them. However, the Ottomans were like, please uphold the law, right? Don't break any rules. You're going to be fine. Um, and it was one of the things that facilitated and made it possible for the Ottomans to attract foreigners. There were, of course, exceptions to Oman, like Janissaries, elite Ottoman soldiers. There have been records of them being cruel to outsiders from time to time, um, if it served in their personal interest. They could be beating merchants or taking away their goods, etc., etc. Um, but however, it is important to outline that the Janissaries have been cruel to everyone, including the locals, right? The citizens of the Ottoman Empire, the subjects of Sultan. So it is an exception rather than the rule. So more often than not, people would be having personal protection from the Sultan when they are outsiders, when they're foreigners traveling to Ottoman Empire. So this is the picture of Janissaries. On the left, you have the original, older version of Janissaries having bows and sabers, or yatagans. But on the right side, you see a more modern version of them because some of them are already carrying firearms, obviously. So it's closer to them being disbanded. At some point, they were such a trouble, such a nuisance for the Sultan that they just disbanded them altogether. So people who offered the protection were usually merchants or diplomats. To them, the Sultan gave special status and privileges called capitulation. For example, foreigners under the protection who were accused of a crime had the right for representation, usually by someone from foreigner's embassy or consulate, somebody who knew both languages, which is very progressive for the time because, in the European countries, you would see nothing like that. Quite typically, you would not be um, you would not be able to use any sort of representation at court, especially if it was, let's say, position. What kind of what kind of representation would you have there? Foreign traders quite oftenly were supposed to pay a special tax. The irony is that this special tax was actually lower than the one um, that the locals were paying. So they typically would be paying 3 to 5%, and the locals would be paying more. At the same time, the most influential traders would be able to talk the officials into actually giving them taxes exemptions for good, like paying no taxes whatsoever. Quite often that involved bribes and stuff, but they would be able to do that and actually pay nothing in terms of tax. It would make the trade extremely profitable for European traders. And this is how the Ottomans have been attracting traders and have been generally attracting talent as well, right? They've been making sure that the trade is happening over there because the more trade happens, the more benefits you'll have because it attracts money by other means as well, not just by particularly paying, directly paying tariffs. Um, this is how basically foreigners constituted an elite group within the empire were always welcomed. Um, Legally, any foreigner who stayed in the Ottoman lands for more than 1 year automatically became a subject of the Sultan. But that was a formality because, how do you judge somebody who is not a subject of your country, right? Of your Sultan? In practice, the Ottomans almost never enforced this policy, in real life, and normally, as long as foreigners did not marry an Ottoman subject or buy real estate, they were able to retain their loyalty to the ruler of their home country, which was a big deal back then. And even the rule in marriage was quite flexible and wasn't quite oftenly enforced. Many foreigners kept their foreign identity after marrying an Ottoman subject. Um, Travelers passing through Ottoman domains included traders, merchants, Christian missionaries, diplomats, and people who in general wanted to learn more about Islamic empires and the people on pilgrimages, because again, religious sites on the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans permitted such foreigners to live and work in Istanbul and even hired some into the government, something that was never seen in Europe, which, again, if you are very xenophobic, if you're suspicion of the foreigners, if you're in suspicion of foreigners, you typically don't hire them into your government. But Ottoman Empire did that specifically because they cherished foreign talent, right? They recognized the talent and they were willing to um, make sure these people are with them, right? The Venetians and the French, for instance, had embassies in the center of Istanbul. These diplomats and merchants were for the Ottomans a significant source of information on the state of European politics because, again, technically, territorially, Ottoman Empire is a little far away from the rest of Europe, so they needed more intel and information about what is going on, who's friends with whom, who's the enemies now, who's fighting, and etc. etc. What's the ideas about the Ottoman Empire in Europe? So the Turkish Kaftanate, as of 1838, is basically the alternative of the European salons at the same time. The salon is this place where you drink champagne and you talk to smoke cigarettes, of course, so not cigarettes, cigars, of course, because again, established gentleman either smokes a pipe or a cigar, and also talk about politics, business, whatever kind of affairs you need to talk to, a place to get important connections. And this is the same with Turkish kafenet. But why coffee, right? Because again, alcohol is haram, obviously, so nobody's drinking alcohol. And coffee is, since the dawn of times, the substitute social drink for anybody who is a Muslim in the Middle East. Even today in Abu Dhabi or Dubai, business people, where do they go, right? So in Europe, quite oftenly you would, like in the university, let's say, in the evening, people are like, okay, let's go have a beer, right? And that's like a social drink. It's not to get drunk. It's sort of like a social lubricant, so people could be a little more a little more open to one another, talk a little bit more, and easily socialize. But in the Middle East right now, it is coffee, right? So Starbucks typically is this place of social connections where people go and legitimately discuss multi-million-dollar deals and their business. So again, cafe night is traditionally this place of attraction for important people for socializing, etc. So the millet system is another thing. So we already talked about the foreigners. Well, the people who are now the subjects of Sultan, they've resettled to the territory of the Ottoman Empire. They're under their rule, but they're foreigners by design in terms of being of different faith or different ethnicity or sometimes both. What's up with them? So for them, the Ottoman Empire has introduced the millet system. Um, Ottoman rulers, they recognized the autonomy of various religious groups and ethnic groups within the empire, and this is how they have been um, providing a sustainable environment for them. Um, they were able to live within those own communities under their own laws, religious or social, regardless. This arrangement allowed Jewish or Greek Orthodox or other Christian communities to keep their own religious practices and separate religious courts to regulate these practices. This enabled them to largely manage their own affairs, and the only things that they needed to provide in return was loyalty to the Sultan. So they avoided persecution and thrived under the Ottoman rule, not having to be Turk or Muslim. How did trade and commerce generally happen? Merchants from England, France, Venice, and later Netherlands were allowed to travel absolutely freely in the capital and the provincial centers. Typically, the port cities are, also included. Trade routes such as Silk Road and others ran through the empire, and thereby invited many foreigners along these routes to travel through Ottoman lands. In those cases, in some cases, these foreigners had little contact with Muslim residents of these cities sometimes, as they lived, separately in their own quarters or sections of urban neighborhoods. But in other cases, however, especially in the port cities, Foreigners did business with Muslims directly and had daily interactions with them. So, enriching themselves with Muslim Turkish culture and vice versa. Um, Bringing some more of their own culture to the locals as well. Merchants from Italian cities such as Venice visited Ottoman Empire Muslim traders, also reciprocated by going to Venice, right, to trade. So it was quite mutual. French traders lived and worked in Izmir, traded with Greek and Armenian traders, although originally wasn't exactly favored because uh, the Ottoman Empire would prefer the traders to concentrate and bring more money to the center rather than to millets, right? And just to illustrate the degree of penetration, the cultural and political penetration of European and the Turk Muslim um, civilization, uh, is this case of the Venetian ruler's son who worked in Istanbul for Ottoman government and kept his Catholic religion and was perfectly fine. Later, he served as a high official in Ottoman Hungary and conquered territory, right? But was assassinated by the anti-Ottoman Hungarians. And this also gives us a little more insight into how Europeans have worked for the empire. So this is the picture of foreign envoys and the Sultan, underlining the importance and the power that Sultan wields. Um, what about power and diversity? So foreigners even became the part of the ruling elite, right? How did that diversity go into the political rule all of a sudden? Because we're talking about an empire. Empire was a sultan, right? So it's a monarchy. How does that work? Well, the Ottomans possessed two types of rulers within their empire: those who governed the House of Islam, traditional Muslim lands, and those who governed the House of War. I'm sorry, which is a non-traditional, non-Muslim lands, right? Something that has been conquered and the population is typically non-Muslim. House of Islam leaders were the Ottoman rulers themselves and the Sunni Muslim rulers, right? The House of War leaders were non-Muslims, and they were rulers of separate city-states or provinces within the empire, such as Dubrovnik, Hungary, Moldavia, Transylvania, Wallachia, and northern African domains. For instance, Charles Gordon was a British subject that was the Pasha ruling governor of the Ottoman province of Sudan in North Africa. So Charles Gordon, a Pasha for the Ottoman Empire, right, particularly of Sudan in the 1870s. A German named Eduard Schnitzer, the so-called Min Pasha, ruled over the province of Equatorial African Uganda, just south of Sudan, in the same period. So neither Eduard Schnitzer nor the Charles Gordon, none of them are Muslims, none of them are Turks, quite clearly by their names. They're clearly European people who have been hired for the town, right? And the Ottomans were able to see past religious identity, ethnical identity, or any other identity that there is, and employ people who are talented and have merit to bring to the empire. There was no strict division between the Ottoman subjects and in the outside world, particularly in spite of clear legal distinctions between the two. In the Ottoman environment, even slaves and their masters could become friends and realm of day-to-day life, and even slavery itself was a little different from the horrible slavery that we know in Europe. Of course, slavery is horrible anyway, but the attitude towards slaves was somewhat different. Maps, books, and painted pictures show the world beyond Ottoman Empire to the Ottoman people, so they were aware of, even though there was a ban on these images, but the Ottoman people were generally aware of what the world was outside, right? Not just like the Japanese that were kept in isolation purposefully, because they felt secure and there was no threat to religion or the rule of the Sultan. Ottoman rulers could be more flexible in their dealings with the outsiders. The Ottoman government invited ambassadors from the major powers of Europe to reside in Istanbul at the time when this practice was only beginning to become commonplace within European capitals. And most of the envoys, because in Europe they were still like envoys, was the leftover elements of religious Catholic Church system of religious envoys. So all those envoys would be suspected and most likely would be, truly, would be spies, right? And would be spying for their masters on the country that they've come to. But despite all those risks of espionage and shady dealings, the Ottomans still welcomed those people simply because the profit and the benefit would be a lot higher than the risks taken in this regard. So Again, simply because they'd been so powerful of an empire, they didn't have to fear conquest or wars or military aggression coming from the Europeans. Um, Outsiders, to be fair, must have also perceived Ottoman rule positively because they sent ambassadors and quite sometimes formed alliances, more often, of course, in the following centuries, like the 18th and 19th century, rather than before, during the active European conquest phase. But still, quite often, especially with Russia on the map, Europeans quite often found themselves in need of ad hoc alliances with the Ottomans to balance out the rising empire of the Russians that had been also expanding quite aggressively and have been taking active part in European affairs, especially after the war of the Napoleonic Wars in War of 1812. Um, so the Ottoman government viewed alliances with Christian princes, of course, strategically. What does that mean? That means that um, they were not long term, they were not fundamental in terms of being a dynastical alliance or any other kind of alliance. They had very few, as already said, alliances before 1700. They didn't really need to, and was a territorial expansion. So those people would rather be prey to the empire rather than the allies. But um, with the Russian incursion to the Black Sea area and the Balkans in the late 18th century, the Ottomans aggressively sought alliances with Britain and France to counter the Russian threat. Ottoman religious toleration of 1500s allowed Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries also to enter Ottoman domains and be quite active in terms of trying to convert Orthodox Christians to Catholicism. Those missionaries also attempted to gain control of the religious side on the Ottoman territory, such as Jerusalem, much to the disgust of Ottoman officials who didn't really understand that sort of behavior. Again, active conversions didn't really happen in the Ottoman Empire. Everything was done willingly. When people did that simply out of benefit, because there have been so many benefits in return. And those who weren't Ottomans typically had to pay jizya, right, the tax on being non-Muslim. So in order to not pay that tax and also to receive all the benefits that the other Muslim residents received, a lot of people did convert, and that was a significant thing back then, right? Because your religious identity was number one, especially in 1500s. That was number one identity. It wasn't about being French. It wasn't about being English. It's about being Christian, right? Um, and quite oftenly, the toleration of Orthodox Christians sometimes has been backfiring on the Ottomans because the Eastern Orthodox Church has been founded in Constantinople, and while Christians had traditions that differ from Catholic Christianity and was quite close to Russian and Serbian Orthodox churches, and even through conflicts with Russia, that church would be the provider of Russian interests, basically would spy in favor of Russia, would provide support to Russian spies or generally Russian refugees or people, but still um, the Ottoman Empire would not pressure the Orthodox Church in Istanbul or anywhere else in the empire, despite the quite clear risks and issues associated with that. This is the Ottoman Sultan of 18th century, just outlining, the picture is clearly outlining the wealth and grandeur of the Ottoman Sultan court. What were the obstacles of toleration in the empire? Of course, because at this point you'd be like, Professor, seems like, too good to be true, right? And at some point, yes, there've been a lot of difficulties. We're talking about a less tolerant time, more violent time. So of course there've been a lot of issues. Um, a lot of Ottomans have seen the policy of toleration as questionable. The Ottoman Turks were overwhelmingly Sunni Muslims, but a minority, let's say, took up Shia Islam. And this became a source of friction because a neighboring country, which is modern-day Iran, Safavid Empire, for instance, it was called back then, was specifically fighting for the dominance of the religion or of the religious Muslim world, and it specifically took Shia Islam, has developed Shia Islam as as a tool of political division, as a tool of acquiring political influence, right? Um, so of course the relationship between the Shia and the Sunni have been quite significantly tense for the existence of both states. But there have been people like dervishes, Sufi dervishes, who are technically Shia, but some say that it's a whole separate wing, so don't mix it up. So these dervishes have been quite popular, have been roaming through the empire, been quite popular, especially with the Janissary corps. And Sufis have generally have been criticized by Muslim leaders within the empire for such unorthodox ideas and practices like their dancing. If you would Google Sufi, right, you would find in Google the first pictures to come up would be Sufi Muslims dancing, right? The dervishes are dancing, right? Something that was not very normal or that wasn't okay within the traditional Sunni Islam in the empire, and that also related to all the other expressive arts and stuff. Um, as a result, um, there was a ban on Sufis, right? It happened in 1826, and the Janissary Corps was also abolished at the same time. But even then, the ban was short-lived, and the Ottomans thereafter encouraged religious toleration, their effort to align themselves with the parallel growth of religious freedom and tolerance in Europe, trying to be a little close to Europeans, associating itself a little more with Western civilization despite being Muslim. Um, Western means Europe-centered back then. Not long after the foundation of the Ottoman Empire, a rival Muslim state, as I already said, I mentioned Iran, Safavid Empire, and the commitment to fight the Ottomans for the religious power, for the religious influence, has pushed them to create their own branch of Islam. Um, the Ottoman Empire thus found itself the religious and political rival on the map. Major wars have been fought between them in the 16th century and from time to time later on during the Ottoman Wars with the Habsburgs in Europe and the Safavids in the 17th century. Foreigners of these warring powers were expected to leave the country. None of them were arrested, none of them were held for ransom. No, they just please leave while we're fighting the war, right? Which is very, very liberal and so a very tolerant approach. Though the merchants of the enemy were sometimes imprisoned, the wares confiscated, it was rather an exception rather than the rule. So, um, controlling the activities of foreigners, especially the frontiers of the empire, became more and more difficult as the Ottoman control has diminished throughout the time. Certain notables and landowners worked directly with French traders, as we already said, like the Greeks, for instance, on the Greek coast. And the French exported olives, from which oil was extracted from the manufacture of palm-olive soap in Marseille, France, and they preferred to deal directly with the traders rather than paying to the center, right? And so the locals have been happy with that because they got to retain more riches in their own pockets and not sharing that with the centralized authority. The experience of foreigners at the northern frontier of the Ottoman Empire was the most problematic. This area was contested in wars between Russia and the Ottomans in the 1760s and onwards. These conflicts produced hostility among Ukrainian and other people towards Ottomans because Ottomans technically originally controlled the area. So whenever the Russians would come up, the scourge of war would influence them, but the questions would not be asked towards Russians. Like they wouldn't be directed to Russians. Why are you conquering it? The questions would be to the Ottomans, who were supposed to protect, right? And weren't able to do that. What is up with prisoners and slaves in the Ottoman Empire? What is their fate? Because Ottoman state was often at war, expanding and defending the frontiers, it accumulated many foreign prisoners of war. Islamic law considered enslavement of these prisoners of war and many other people legal. To be fair, the rest of the world during that period was also a slave owner society. All of them have been slave owner societies. Slavery was normalized, even in Europe, right? The Ottoman Empire's vast reach into the Middle East and North Africa meant the Ottomans controlled shipping lanes in the Mediterranean. With fast armed corsairs, they were able to attack trading ports, small islands, as well as merchant vessels of their enemies. Captives were ransomed for money, but if the families would not pay, prisoners were sold to the Ottoman Empire's slave markets as slaves. The enemies of Russia also sold thousands of Russian captives in the Ottoman slave market in Kaffa in Crimea, giving the name to the whole phenomena. Slave comes from Slav. Whenever they ask him, who are you? Like, Slav, right? Slavic. I'm like, okay, slave. And this is how the word has entered English language as well. Um, literally marking the whole phenomena by the ethnicity that have been mostly sold in the Turkish and in the Ottoman slave markets. So in the 16th century, there were literally tens of thousands of Ottoman slaves in Italy, however, and Sicily. So, Europe returned the favor. Everybody has been enslaved, all right? Unlike the progressive American left-wing activists say, it's not only black people who've been enslaved throughout history. All the ethnicities and all the people of the world have at some point have been having slavery, and all of them have been, bought and sold. In addition, slave captives from Russia and Ukraine were introduced to the Ottoman slave markets by the Crimean Tatars, who also been quite often raiding Russian territories and capturing Slav people. Um, this is a picture of a slave market in Kaffa. Crimea was very busy, one of the largest slave markets in its own part of the world. And conditions for slaves on both sides were sometimes very severe. There have been many accounts of people being cruel to their slaves, but more often than not, in the Ottoman Empire, you would see a little more humane attitude towards the slaves. For instance, by Islamic law, you are not allowed to own a slave who is also Muslim. Muslim person cannot enslave Muslim person. What does that mean? That if a slave is willing to accept Islam, he's immediately free. So why were there any slaves in the Ottoman Empire then? Why wouldn't they just go all convert and then just leave and stay true to their religion? Because we're talking about the time where the religious identity, as already said, was fundamental. People would prefer to become eunuchs, means become castrated, rather than change their religion, right? They would take physical harm and maiming um, as something more favorable than changing their religion, because in the eyes of God, that is a deadly sin, right? And yes, they would be free here, and their life that would end at some point, sometimes sooner than later. What happens in the heavenly life? How are you going to justify this in the eyes of Jesus Christ? And of course, a lot of them have stayed true to their religion then. European slaves, just for comparison, would never have any representation. Nobody would consider their rights. Nobody would, of course, free them if they would become Christian, right? That mechanism never existed. And we all know how cruel the transatlantic slave trade has become, and how Americans have been, the progressive and enlightened Protestant people in the Americas have been approaching slavery very utilitarianistically, right, and have been um, treating their slaves as nothing more than cattle, basically. So, uh, at its height, the Ottoman Empire was feared by Europeans as the scourge of Christendom, but was also admired for its wealth, military might, and magnificent Sultan court. However, the early success of its political and military institutions, its ability to generate wealth via the conquest of new lands, and ability to tap into the Asian trade easily without having to do much for it, has played a very cruel joke to the Ottoman rule. It basically blinded them to the inherent weakness of this system of the monarchical structure, the potential for corruption that has become absolutely wild in the later stages of the empire, and the inherent privileges of, say, elites, including military elite like the Janissaries, the dangers arising from abstaining from industrialization, just like many similar empires, like Russia, for instance, have believed themselves to be so developed that they abstained from industrialization. And because of that, they have missed the opportunity. They missed to note that they didn't happen to notice the change of relative power between them and the Europeans. How very soon, in a very short period of time, European states became so powerful, they started to challenge these empires. Um, that was unfortunately the case with the Ottomans. They have been confident in their continued superiority, which undermined their ability to see how the West has been overcoming some of the same challenges and obstacles in growth, and been growing way past in terms of their power than the Ottomans. First phase of industrialization in Europe, and later in Tsarist Russia, enabled its armies to win battles against the Ottomans and push the Ottomans out of much of Eastern Europe. These victories embodied Western writers to define their own rising civilization as a dominant civilization, as the only one able to progress and develop. And they've seen the Islamic societies as static, unable to develop. They've been attributing all these stereotypes to them that, of course, weren't exactly true. but it created this attitude towards everything non-Christian, uh, everything Muslim. They've taken to reconsider what they once believed to be the brilliance of Ottoman court as to uh, demonic, tyrannical place all of a sudden, and the great uh, military machine of the Ottomans to become the archaic product of militarism, etc., etc. So everything positive that has been perceived positive about the Ottoman Empire slowly has developed into this um, derogatory idea of a backward society, right? Of course, European states themselves shared the same vices. Such realities had, however, little impact on the growing Western propensity to see themselves as the only positive role models and the only way to develop properly an Ottoman society negatively is this exotic and inferior other. There's a phenomenon called Orientalism. If you are from IR and you haven't read Edward Said, you should read him. The book is literally called Orientalism, and it is something that you literally should read about uh, before you continue studying, history and politics in general, especially if you are from a non-European environment, right? Um, so everything then be labeled Orient, East, be it Indians, Chinese, Japanese people, Southeast Asian, nobody would make any difference between all these people, which is one of the um, additional traits of that derogatory, discriminative attitude that the Europeans had, everybody of non-European origin. So Ottoman court may have been slow to see these changes, but they definitely at some point uh, started to understand the need to modernize, and they started to do what they called defensive modernization. So they didn't try to aggressively modernize, ruining the institutions that had been working throughout the years, but they started to introduce new novelties straight from Europe, trying to put them neatly integrate them into this Ottoman Empire's structure. Universities with education under the Western model have been introduced. The land has been privatized, quite oftenly to inconvenience of the normal people, ordinary people, because it would take away a lot of benefits that they've had and degree of protection offered by the Sultan. The means of public communication were expanded, Western political freedoms were introduced, such as granting of formal equality between Muslim and non-Muslim subjects within the empire. However, the turmoil created by these changes, because they've happened too late and the empire was already in distress, have stressed out the system so much that on the side of non-Turkish minorities, they've seen it as a sign of weakness the empire, while the Turkish people might have believed to be, um, the non-Muslims decided that this is a sign that we can strive and achieve our independence from the empire, while the Muslim and Turk population has seen that as a betrayal of their faith, their principles, and that was done to their advantage, basically. So on the both sides of the spectrum, it has been a point of conflict and tension and has caused major disarray within the empire, bringing it, facilitating bringing it down. The conclusion is very simple. Problems have piled up, and by the time of World War One, many would-be reformers of the Ottoman Empire among the Turkish population envisioned the creation of this great Turkish state that would they could take from Arab, Berber, Greek, and Kurdish areas of the empire, would be this multi-ethnic, cosmopolitan community. But this nation-building impulse, within its emphasis on Turkish ethnicity and language, that sometimes has prevailed over this idea of cosmopolitanism, become, largely more and more popular. Majority of the population of the empire closer to its demise, and it's pushed away um, the idea of tolerance. So it pushed Turks away from the traditional Ottoman tolerance of its minority communities towards this nationalism that was already quite popular in Europe. It was the foundation, the fundamental principle of European politics at the same time, at the same era. In the midst of the war itself, many Turks also came to view these people as potential threats to their security, with horrific consequences, like particularly the genocide of the Armenians. Uh, in such an atmosphere, it's not surprising that the Ottoman defeat in the war has basically solidified the end of the empire. A dissolution by the early treaty in 1922 was accompanied by an expulsion of ethnic tensions, and representatives of Arab communities met in Syria to explore the creation of an Arab homeland. They saw it could then, however, they couldn't really agree whether it should be only for Muslim Arabs or for all Arabs, or including Arab-speaking Christians, or um, all minorities at the same time. An overwhelmingly Muslim but modern nation was founded by Turks on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. Thanks to Ataturk, or the Father Turk, right? He um, basically envisioned returning to this Ottoman toleration, but with new principles of openness, of toleration, of transparency. Largely, if you would look at the principles of Ataturk, largely progressive European values um, that have been integrated into this traditional Ottoman toleration principles. Um, but even there, intolerance um, triumphed. Turks expelled Greeks from the Mediterranean coast, in part because Greeks have also seized Salonika, but regardless, the tensions have still been there. And unfortunately, ever since then, the Turkish state has never been as tolerant as the Ottoman Empire. But you can see quite clearly that um, the closer Ottoman Empire got to the dissolution, to the breakdown, the more problems piled up, the less uh, tolerant it became. And quite clearly, the less tolerant it became, the more problems have been deepened. Right? Um, so, in general, this is how the um, loose-knit empire that allowed different ethnic groups to define their own experiences with one another has managed to survive uh, so many years. But when the age of rising nationalism, I would even say raging nationalism, came around, it was quite clearly becoming too problematic to maintain that uh, diversity and toleration of diversity. While Western writers has once admired the relative peace and tranquility this diverse population long enjoyed, they eventually buried the history of Ottoman open-mindedness and prosperity under charges of Oriental brutality and basis. Such revisionism is now at work in Muslim intellectual quarters. Today, some within radical Islamic movements advocate the revival of the Islamic world empire, but they reject hybridity and toleration, which accounted for the Ottoman state's longevity and much of its grandeur. So basically, the idea is that it's not just about Muslims, right? It's not just about building states for a particular ethnicity, like the Arabs, for instance. No, it is about diverse people that have been and freely living within one empire and contributing each accordingly to their own merit that has given a chance for such a great empire to exist. While we still have time, right? This is the slide that basically concentrates on what you should watch. Some of these are quite long, but I would particularly urge you guys to uh, watch the first one, this one, right? It is, and the second one is also quite important. I would see that you guys would be interested in that one as well, because it does delve deeper into the division between the Muslim Arabs and Muslim Ottomans. Um, so I would particularly, the history of the Ottoman Empire, this one, it is purely optional because it's very long. But these first two, you should definitely watch, especially the one why Ottoman Empire didn't compete nation of Americas, being one of the strongest states, just basically ignored Western Hemisphere. While smaller states like Portugal and Spain have been so active, incredible, right? Uh, this is the task for next week. When we meet, um, there are 5 questions and reading from page 55 to 73. Not even 20 pages, guys. 18. So again, all these questions are available if you want to review them. PowerPoint is available in the file section, and please be prepared to discuss this when we meet screen to screen online. This is the end for today's lecture. Again, don't forget to watch the videos that I've shown you. The direct links to the videos, to the YouTube versions of the videos, is on this slide, right? You can find it in the file section and get the link directly to the video, and then get this as well. Okay, I'll see you next time.